The impossible assignment. The Galactic Communication Institute towered above the crystal plains of Nexus Prime, its translucent walls pulsing with data streams from 10,000 worlds. Inside its hallowed halls, the finest linguistic minds in the galaxy worked to bridge the gaps between species, to find common ground in the vast ocean of alien thought. Here, translation wasn't just about words, it was about preserving meaning across the impossible distances between minds evolved under different stars. Dr. Amara Okonkwo stood before the Council of Translators, her dark hands clasped behind her back, her posture betraying none of the nervous energy that churned in her stomach. She was human, one of only 3 employed by the Institute, and she knew that every eye in that chamber viewed her presence as either a curiosity or a mistake. The singers of Melodia have been attempting contact for 17 standard years, High Translator Vexthar announced, his crystalline form refracting light into rainbow patterns across the chamber floor. Every linguistic algorithm, every translation matrix, every consciousness bridge protocol has failed. Their language defeats our most advanced systems. Amara knew the story. Everyone in the Institute did. The Melodians were an aquatic species whose entire civilization existed in the crushing depths of their ocean world. They communicated through song, complex arrangements of sound, pressure, and bioluminescence that carried meaning in layers no other species could perceive, much less translate. 17 artificial intelligence systems have analyzed their transmissions, continued Vexthar, his tone carrying the weight of institutional failure. 3 organic telepaths attempted direct mind-to-mind contact and suffered permanent neural damage. The Melodians grow impatient. They threaten to withdraw from all galactic contact, believing we deliberately ignore their overtures. And you want me to try, Amara said, her voice steady despite the enormity of what was being asked. We want you to fail, said Counselor Thresh Nal, an insectoid being whose mandibles clicked with barely concealed disdain. Publicly and definitively, so the Council can declare the Melodian language fundamentally incompatible with galactic communication standards. Your human brain, limited by its evolutionary constraints, will provide the final proof we need to close this embarrassing chapter. The word stung, but Amara had heard worse. Humans were considered linguistic primitives by galactic standards. Their single-language families, their reliance on sound-based communication, their inability to perceive the quantum fluctuations that underlay Vexthar's crystalline speech, all of it marked them as barely adequate for the simplest translation work. I'll do it, Amara said simply. The depths of sound. The Melodian transmission chamber was unlike anything else in the Institute. Where other rooms were filled with holographic displays and neural interface equipment, this space contained only water, millions of liters of it, maintained at precisely 274 Kelvin and pressurized to match the crushing depths of Melodia's deepest trenches. The water was real ocean water, shipped across light years at extraordinary expense, because the Melodians insisted that their language could not be separated from the medium through which it traveled. Amara floated in a protective suit that allowed her to survive the pressure, surrounded by darkness broken only by the bioluminescent markers that defined the chamber's boundaries. Her translator's workstation was a waterproof slate that could display data in 3 dimensions, but she'd turned it off for now. The machines had failed. She needed to try something different. She needed to listen with human ears. The Melodian song began as a vibration in her bones, a frequency so low that it existed more as feeling than sound. Then came the harmonics, layer upon layer of melody that seemed to exist in dimensions her mind could barely process. And woven through it all, pulses of bioluminescent light that carried meaning her eyes couldn't quite capture but her brain somehow registered. For 3 hours, Amara simply floated and listened. The Council had given her unlimited access to the chamber, expecting her to exhaust herself in days and admit defeat. But Amara had learned something during her years studying the thousands of human languages that had evolved on Earth before the Great Unification. She'd learned that meaning existed not just in words, but in the spaces between them. In rhythm and tone and the subtle interplay of sound and silence. And she was beginning to hear something familiar in the Melodian song. It wasn't the notes themselves. It wasn't the bioluminescent pulses or the pressure waves that made her teeth ache. It was the structure underneath it all, the pattern that reminded her of something she'd studied years ago. A language from Earth's past, one that had seemed impossibly complex until she'd understood its fundamental logic. Vietnamese. A tonal language where the same sound could mean 6 different things depending on how it was pitched. Where meaning existed not in the sounds themselves, but in their relationships to each other, in the rise and fall of tone that created semantic distinctions invisible to speakers of non-tonal languages. The Melodians weren't speaking in words. They were speaking in pure relationship, in the connections between sounds rather than the sounds themselves. Every note gained meaning from every other note, every flash of bioluminescence defined by its position in a web of light. It was like trying to understand a language where every word changed definition based on every other word in the sentence, an exponential explosion of possible meanings that defeated every computational approach. But human brains weren't computers. Human brains were pattern recognition engines evolved to navigate the infinite complexity of social relationships, to track dozens of variables simultaneously in the chaotic environment of tribal life. Human brains were very, very good at seeing patterns in seemingly random data. Amara started to sing. The Bridge of Understanding. Her first attempts were clumsy, embarrassing. She couldn't produce the subsonic rumbles or the ultrasonic harmonics. Her bioluminescent markers were crude mechanical approximations of the melodian's natural light. But she could capture the structure, the relationships between tones, the pattern that gave meaning to the chaos. She sang for 6 hours straight, her voice growing hoarse, her mind stretched to breaking as she tried to hold the entire web of relationships in her consciousness simultaneously. And then, finally, something changed in the water around her. The melodian response came gentle at first, almost questioning. A simple pattern, repeated 3 times. Amara felt her heart race as she recognized what she was hearing, not words, but the melodian equivalent of "Can you hear me?" Yes, she sang back, translating the concept into their relational structure. I hear you. The water erupted with song. Not the measured transmissions the Institute had been receiving, but something raw and emotional, joy, relief, excitement all woven together in harmonics that made Amara's eyes fill with tears. For 17 years, the Melodians had been screaming into the void, convinced that the galaxy was ignoring them, that they were alone in the universe. And now, finally, someone had answered. Over the next 3 days, Amara barely left the chamber. She ate in the water, slept in the water, devoted every waking moment to learning the nuances of melodian song. And as her understanding deepened, she began to grasp something that made her earlier translation work seem trivial by comparison. The Melodians didn't just have a complex language. They had a fundamentally different way of thinking about reality itself. Where other species saw objects and actions, the Melodians saw relationships and transformations. Their songs didn't describe the universe, they described the connections between things, the invisible web of causality and correlation that bound all things together. A rock wasn't a rock to them. It was a nexus of relationships, connected to the ground through gravity, to the water through erosion, to living beings through the minerals it provided. Their language forced you to think about everything in context, to see the universe not as a collection of separate things but as a unified whole where everything touched everything else. It was, Amara realized with growing wonder, the most sophisticated language she'd ever encountered. Not primitive, not incomprehensible, just operating on principles that no other species had developed. Principles that, ironically, human languages came closer to matching than any other in the galaxy. When she finally emerged from the chamber, weak and exhausted but triumphant, the Council of Translators waited with expressions that ranged from shock to disbelief. Impossible, Thresh-Nal breathed. The probability calculations were based on machine logic, Amara interrupted, her voice raw but steady. The Melodians don't think like machines. They think like poets. And humans understand poetry. She activated her slate, displaying the first complete Melodian to Galactic Standard translation in history. It wasn't perfect, some concepts would never translate cleanly. But it was enough. Enough to build understanding, to forge connections, to welcome an entire civilization into the galactic community. The council's silence. High Translator Vexthar studied the translation for a long moment, his crystalline form shifting through colors that indicated deep thought. How? He asked simply. How did your primitive neural architecture succeed where our most advanced systems failed? Amara smiled, exhaustion making her bold. Because human brains aren't optimized for processing information, they're optimized for understanding people. We evolved to track social relationships in groups of hundreds, to understand meaning from context and tone and 1,000 subtle cues. The Melodian language isn't a computational problem. It's a social one. And humans are very, very social. She pulled up another display, showing the analysis her human brain had performed unconsciously, the pattern recognition that had cut through 17 years of failure in 3 days of focused listening. The council members leaned closer, their various sensory organs focused on the data with new interest. Every species in this institute comes from a world where they were apex predators or solitary philosophers, Amara continued. But humans? Humans survived by cooperating with each other, by building communities, by learning to communicate across language barriers because our tribes didn't have a common tongue. We had to get good at understanding each other, or we died. Remarkable, Vexthar said softly. We dismissed human linguistic capability because your languages seemed simple compared to our quantum-encoded speech or the hive's pheromone matrices. But simplicity in form doesn't mean simplicity in function. Exactly, Amara agreed. The Melodians don't need complex words because their entire language is built on capturing complexity through relationships. And humans don't need enhanced sensory organs because we learn to extract maximum information from minimal input. We're both doing the same thing, just from different directions. Thrashinael's mandibles clicked in what might have been respect or might have been annoyance. This changes the Institute's hiring practices considerably. If human neural architecture provides unique advantages, it provides different advantages, Amara corrected. Not better, not worse. Different. That's the whole point of what I learned from the Melodians. Everything is about relationships and context. Human brains aren't superior, they're just optimized for different problems. Problems that happen to overlap with Melodian cognition in useful ways. The message that changed everything. A week later, the first official Melodian delegation arrived at Nexus Prime, their transport ship filled with pressurized water and equipped with the translation protocols Amara had developed. The Council of Translators gathered to welcome them, with Amara standing at the center of the reception chamber, her translation slate ready. The lead Melodian emerged from the transport tube, her bioluminescent patterns pulsing with meanings Amara was still learning to read. Through the water-filled communication sphere, the alien began to sing, and Amara translated in real time, her human voice giving words to concepts that had never before crossed the species barrier. We have been alone, the Melodian sang, and Amara heard the layers of meaning beneath the surface: isolation, fear, the desperate hope that somewhere in the vast universe, someone would understand. For 17 cycles, we called into the dark, believing ourselves the only minds capable of perceiving the web of all things. We thought you ignored us because you found us unworthy. Now we know, you simply couldn't hear our song. Until one human did, Vexthar responded through Amara's translation. And in doing so, she taught us that our technologies, our algorithms, our certainty about the limits of communication, all of it was based on assumptions that excluded entire modes of thought. The Melodian song grew complex, weaving patterns of gratitude and curiosity. We wished to know about humans. The species that could hear us when others could not. What makes your minds capable of bridging the gap between our worlds? Amara felt every eye in the chamber turn to her. She took a breath, gathered her thoughts, and began to speak, not just for herself, but for all of humanity. We're not special because we're strong or smart or technologically advanced, she said, her words translated into the Melodians' relational song language. We're special because we survived by understanding each other. By learning to see the world through different eyes, to hear meanings in unfamiliar sounds, to build bridges across chasms of misunderstanding. She paused, letting the translation ripple through the water. On Earth, we had thousands of languages. different sounds, different structures, different ways of thinking about reality. And we didn't have technology to translate for us. We just had each other. So we learned to listen, really listen, to find the patterns underneath the differences, the common humanity beneath the alien surface. You are philosophers, the Melodians sang. No, Amara replied with a smile. We're just very, very good at making friends. And sometimes, that's the most important skill in the universe. The web that connects all minds. The revolution begins. The news of Amara's success rippled across the galaxy like a stone thrown into still water. Within weeks, the Galactic Communication Institute was flooded with requests for human translators. Languages that had resisted centuries of analysis, species that had remained isolated from galactic civilization, cultural concepts that had seemed forever locked within their species of origin, all of them suddenly seemed approachable through the lens of human linguistic flexibility. But Amara quickly discovered that her breakthrough had created an unexpected problem. The Institute wanted to replicate her success by training more humans in Melodian translation. They wanted to industrialize the process, to turn her intuitive understanding into a teachable methodology that could be applied across the galaxy. I can't teach you to think like me, Amara explained to a classroom full of eager students. Humans, yes, but also Vexthar's people, Threshenael species, and a dozen others who hope to learn the secret of bridging the unbridgeable gap. I can teach you techniques, I can show you patterns, but the real work happens in parts of your brain that don't follow instructions. It happens when you stop trying to translate and start trying to understand. One student, a young human woman named Sarah Chen, raised her hand. But Dr. Okonkwo, if we can't systematize your approach, how do we scale it? There are millions of languages in the galaxy, thousands of species waiting for first contact. We can't expect a handful of humans to bridge all those gaps. You're right, Amara agreed. Which is why we're not going to approach this like a traditional translation problem. We're going to approach it like a relationship problem. She activated the holographic display, showing a web of interconnected nodes that represented galactic languages. The Institute has always treated translation as a one-to-one conversion. Melodian to Galactic Standard, Crystalline to Common, Hivespeak to Basic. But that's not how human linguistic evolution worked. We didn't have a universal language, we had networks of understanding. Traders who spoke 3 languages, diplomats who could code switch between cultures, children growing up bilingual because their parents came from different tribes. The display shifted, showing clusters of human languages connected by speakers who bridged multiple linguistic communities. We're going to build a network. Not of perfect translations, but of imperfect understanding. Humans who can speak Melodian will teach others the fundamental patterns. Those others will find new applications, new connections. And slowly, we'll weave a web of mutual comprehension that doesn't require perfect translation, just enough shared understanding to build relationships. The unexpected discovery. 3 months into the new program, something extraordinary happened. One of Amara's students, attempting to apply Melodian linguistic patterns to the communication of the luminals, a species of energy beings who existed in quantum superposition, discovered something that changed everything. The luminals had been considered communicatively isolated for centuries. Their consciousness existed in multiple states simultaneously, making linear language impossible. Every attempt to establish communication had failed because translators tried to capture a single meaning from beings who thought in probabilities and parallel possibilities. But Sarah Chen, working with the relational framework of Melodian song, recognized something others had missed. The luminals weren't trying to say one thing, they were trying to say all things simultaneously, to express the full range of probable meanings in a single quantum utterance. It wasn't a bug in their communication, it was the entire point. And humans, it turned out, did something similar with poetry. A human poem didn't have one meaning. It had layers of interpretation, intentional ambiguities, words chosen precisely because they could mean multiple things at once. The skill of reading poetry wasn't extracting the single correct meaning, it was holding multiple meanings in your mind simultaneously, appreciating the tension between interpretations. Sarah's breakthrough opened communication with the liminals, and the implications spread like wildfire through the linguistic community. If humans could bridge both the melodians' relational thinking and the luminals' quantum consciousness, what other impossible languages might yield to human approaches? The answer came faster than anyone expected. Within a year, human translators had established first contact with 17 species previously considered incommunicado. Each success used different aspects of human linguistic capability: the tonal sophistication developed in Asian languages, the contextual complexity of African click languages, the grammatical flexibility of Indo-European constructions, the visual spatial thinking of sign languages. But the real revolution wasn't in the specific techniques. It was in the fundamental shift in how the galaxy approached communication itself. The Council's transformation. 5 years after Amara's initial breakthrough, the Council of Translators convened to discuss a proposal that would have been unthinkable before the Melodian contact. High Translator Vexthar, his crystalline form now bearing new colors that indicated expanded consciousness, presented the motion himself. "We propose," he announced to the assembled delegates, "the complete restructuring of galactic communication standards around the principle of relational understanding rather than exact translation." The chamber erupted in debate. For 10,000 years, the Institute had operated on the assumption that perfect translation was possible, that meaning could be precisely conveyed between any two conscious beings if only the right algorithms were found. Abandoning that principle meant admitting that understanding was always approximate, always contextual, always dependent on relationship rather than rule. "This is madness," Councillor Threshenal protested, though his mandibles clicked with less certainty than they once had. "Without precise translation, how do we establish trade agreements? Negotiate treaties? Ensure that critical information isn't lost or distorted?" Amara, now appointed as Director of Human Linguistic Services, rose to respond. "We already do that," she said calmly. "Think about your own species, Counselor. When you click your mandibles, the exact meaning depends on who you're talking to, what the context is, what your relationship is with the listener. Perfect translation assumes that meaning exists independently of all that context. But it doesn't. Meaning is created in the space between minds, not embedded in the words themselves." She activated a display showing communication success rates before and after the implementation of human-led translation programs. "Since we stopped trying to achieve perfect translation and started trying to achieve genuine understanding, our success rate has increased by 400%. Not because we're translating better, but because we're acknowledging what translation actually is, an imperfect bridge between minds that works because both sides are willing to meet in the middle." Vexthar's form shifted to colors of agreement. "The human approach recognizes something we had forgotten. Communication isn't about transferring information from one consciousness to another intact. It's about creating shared understanding through mutual effort. Both parties must work to bridge the gap. Both must accept that perfect comprehension is impossible, but sufficient understanding is achievable." "And what of species that refuse this approach?" another counselor asked. "What of those who demand precise translation, who cannot accept approximation?" "Then we teach them what the Melodians taught us," Amara replied. "That isolation is the price of demanding perfection. That connection requires vulnerability, requires accepting that you might be misunderstood, requires faith that the other party is trying to understand you even if they don't succeed completely." The vote was close, but the motion passed. The Galactic Communication Institute would undergo fundamental restructuring, shifting from a technology-focused organization to a relationship-focused one. Translation algorithms wouldn't be abandoned, they remained useful tools, but they would be supplemented by human-trained specialists who understood that the map was not the territory, that the translation was not the meaning. The web grows. 10 years after Amara first heard the Melodian song, the galaxy looked different. Not in any physical sense, the same stars burned, the same species occupied their same worlds, but in the invisible web of understanding that connected them. The Melodians had become key partners in the new communication paradigm, their relational thinking complementing human pattern recognition in ways that allowed even more complex translations. Together, Melodian and human teams had established contact with species operating on scales from the quantum to the cosmic, from beings who existed for microseconds to entities whose thoughts took centuries to complete. But the real change was more subtle. Throughout the galaxy, beings who had once viewed translation as a technical problem were learning to view it as a relationship problem. Diplomats spent months learning not just each other's languages, but each other's ways of thinking. Trade negotiations became opportunities for cultural exchange. And everywhere, the principle of relational understanding was replacing the old dream of perfect communication. Amara stood in the Melodian chamber, now a familiar space she visited weekly to maintain her fluency and continue learning the depths of their language. The lead Melodian, Speaker Harmony, as she was called in the approximation of standard, swam through the water, her bioluminescence pulsing with complex meanings. "You have changed us," Harmony sang, and Amara translated not just the words but the layers of meaning underneath: gratitude, transformation, the recognition of debt that could never be repaid. "Before you heard our song, we were alone in our understanding of the universe. Now we know that our way of seeing is not unique, just different. And in that difference, there is beauty." "You changed us too," Amara replied in the Melodian's relational language, her human voice and mechanical translators working together to approximate their song. "You showed us that human linguistic ability wasn't a weakness or a primitive holdover. It was a unique capability that could bridge gaps no technology could cross. You gave us pride in our own minds." "We are connected now," Harmony sang. "All species who have learned this new way of understanding. Connected not by perfect communication, but by perfect effort. By the willingness to be misunderstood, to try again, to meet each other in the space between our differences." Amara felt tears forming as she translated, moved by the beauty of the concept expressed in a language that saw the universe as an interconnected web. "Yes," she agreed. "Connected by relationship, not rule. By understanding, not algorithm. By the recognition that every consciousness is fundamentally alien to every other consciousness, but that we can still build bridges across that alienness if we're willing to try." The legacy of understanding. The ceremony marking the 15th anniversary of First Melodian Contact brought together representatives from across the galaxy. The celebration took place on Nexus Prime, in a specially designed facility that could accommodate species from aquatic to atmospheric to void-dwelling. At the center of the massive chamber stood a monument, a sculpture created by human, Melodian, and crystalline artists working together. It was beautiful in a way that transcended any single species' aesthetic. The crystalline portion refracted light into patterns that carried meaning for those who could perceive quantum states. The Melodian section produced sounds and pressure waves that told stories in relational song. And the human contribution tied it all together with visual representations of the web of understanding that now connected so many worlds. Amara gave the keynote speech, her words translated into hundreds of languages by graduates of the programs she had helped create. 15 years ago, I stood in a chamber filled with water and listened to a language no machine could translate. I succeeded not because I was smarter than the machines, or more advanced, or specially gifted. I succeeded because I was human, and humans learned long ago that understanding each other requires more than just processing information. She paused, looking out at the assembled delegates, so many species, so many forms of consciousness, all of them connected now through the web of imperfect but genuine understanding. We thought we were bringing our linguistic skills to the galaxy, she continued. But what we really brought was something more fundamental. We brought the recognition that being understood is not the same as being perfectly translated. That connection matters more than precision. That the effort to understand is more valuable than the achievement of perfect comprehension. The galaxy is richer now, not because we've solved the translation problem, but because we've admitted that it can never be perfectly solved. And in that admission, we've found something more valuable than perfect communication. We found authentic relationship. We found the courage to reach across the vast distances between minds and say, I don't fully understand you, but I'm trying. And that effort, that attempt, that willingness to be changed by the encounter, that's what really matters. As the ceremony concluded, Amara returned to her quarters and opened a communication channel to Earth. Her mother appeared on the screen, older now but still with the same warm smile Amara remembered from childhood. "Mom," Amara said, "I want to tell you something. Everything I've accomplished here, all of it traces back to those nights when you'd tuck me in and tell me stories in Igbo, even though we lived in a world where everyone spoke English. You taught me that language wasn't just about communication. It was about identity, about connection, about honoring the complexity of human experience." Her mother's eyes filled with tears. "I always knew you'd do great things, baby. But I never imagined you'd change the entire galaxy." "I didn't change the galaxy," Amara corrected with a smile. "I just helped it remember something it had forgotten. That we're all trying to understand each other, all reaching across the darkness between stars to touch another mind. And sometimes, the species best equipped for that task isn't the most advanced or the most powerful. Sometimes it's the species that learn to survive by making friends." As the communication ended, Amara looked out her window at the stars scattered across the infinite dark. Somewhere out there, human translators were establishing first contact with new species, building bridges across impossible distances, weaving the web of understanding ever wider. And somewhere, beings she would never meet were learning that connection was possible, that isolation was a choice rather than an inevitability. The galaxy would never achieve perfect communication. But it had achieved something better, the recognition that imperfect understanding, offered in good faith and received with patience, was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Because in the end, what connected conscious beings across the stars wasn't the precision of their translations. It was the courage to keep trying, to keep reaching out, to keep believing that somewhere in the vast universe, someone else was listening, really listening, and trying just as hard to understand. And sometimes, that was the most beautiful thing in the cosmos.